A language deficiency frame. Children with low socioeconomic, from low socioeconomic background or from immigrant backgrounds deviate from, as I said, the legitimate language norm. These are very general, but very often quotes. My children are not proficient enough in L2 to be successful at school. But at the same time, these same teachers say, my children are not proficient enough in their L1 to use it in the learning process. So there is something negative about children's L1 and there is something negative about their L2. So L2 is seen as a more and more as a kind of Dutch proficiency is seen as a condition, is more and more seen as a condition to school success. My concern here is that we tend to internally within the school tend to outsource language learning and language acquisition processes. And I don't know whether that's the case in the UK. I'd like to have that debate with you, but it is definitely the case in the Flemish context. It goes along with an increase of standardized and central testing, which we have no tradition of in Flanders. But my concern about outsourcing internally in schools, teachers who say, before you come in my classroom, you first need to know, you need to know more Dutch than what you have now. And I'm not talking about newcomers. I'm talking about kids who were born in Flanders, migrant kids who went to kindergarten and who come into G1, first grade, and more teachers say, look, your Dutch isn't proficient enough, you have to stay in K3 or you first have to go to a special teacher. Right. What we also see is that there is, by many teachers, a search for the best language education model. What is well documented is that how language ideologies impact on school policies. I'm not going into that today, but also how it impacts classroom practices. We also know that learning in the dominant language is seen as the legitimate norm, so what we call an L2 submersion model. It is in Flanders, it is the only seen as the only acceptable model. But at the same time, specifically in research context, there is widespread advocacy in favor of bilingual or multilingual education models. And the question that teachers always have is, okay, I try to accept that idea of multilingual or bilingual education. First learn to read and write these kids in their mother tongue as a step up towards the L2. But the question always is which language education model is more effective for L2 acquisition, for children's well-being, as well for closing the achievement gap. Building on what Angela said, what I think is that we have to move from these rather traditional views on language learning, bilingual teaching, bilingual education programs, because we are now through globalization in a context of super diversity. I mean, I'm sure this is the case here as well, but more and more schools in Ghent, for instance, more and more schools that were for a long time homogeneous in the sense of 100% Turkish kids. Now we are talking about 15, 20 different languages that are spoken by the children in most of the schools in places like Ghent, Antwerp, but also other places. And it is within this context where super diversity is becoming the norm that it is important that we have to reflect on the boundaries of the current recipes that are being used in our systems of education. And as we all know, a concept like language, but also citizenship and learning, but definitely language is a social construct. We also have to consider reconstructing them in the light of new and emerging social contexts. So let's suppose that if we get rid of and if we move from that, what I tend to call rather traditional proficiency and even competence paradigm, to a more different paradigm. And if we move from old frameworks to newer frameworks, if we look at language differences instead of language deficiencies, if we look at multilingualism instead of monolingualism, if we look at language repertoires instead of languages as discrete units, And what if we look at language use of or language performance as the learning paradigm instead of proficiency or competency? And here I have to say that the concept, what Constance said in the beginning, also in our national curriculums, well, the Flemish curriculums, there is that thinking of from a competency perspective, but this is definitely not really translated into the real classroom practice, not even in most of teachers' thinking, and definitely not in their practice. The problem, the way competencies in Flanders are operationalized, is that it is deconstructed in knowledge, proficiency, and attitudes. And what you see is that immediately people often rapidly go back to traditional approaches and mainly focus on the knowledge of the language as a system, and to some extent to proficiency, but definitely less to real performance or language use. If we look at a proficiency-based approach, what is the focus? Acquiring the language skills and the sub-skills. The languages are still seen as functional, discrete units. It is competencies that are leading to proficiency, but still I observe a rather explicit focus on language learning. In a more performance-based approach, we try to, the idea is of exploiting the language to function successfully at school. It is about language repertoires as resources for learning, and it is much more focused on tasks that involve language use, and probably a stronger focus on implicit language learning. Again, I'm not talking about language classrooms, I'm talking about mainstream primary or secondary classrooms where there is a history teacher, a maths teacher, and what their role is, how they can contribute to implicit language learning processes. And what we often see is, due to the fact that the paradigm we start from, the frame of reference we have when it comes to language learning across the board, I mean all teachers in schools, is that it is proficiency or situational structural oriented, that due to that maths teachers, history teachers, geography teachers, they don't see a role for themselves when it comes to process of language acquisition. They always think, yeah, but languages, that's for the language teacher. And we miss a lot of opportunities of much of what I call implicit language learning. Another problem is the problem of transfer. The more we stick to that concept of language proficiency, the more we will have a transfer problem towards being able to use the language you learned, the proficiencies you acquired, or the knowledge of the language you acquired. And what we are often not aware of is that the transfer from proficiency to using the language, or the transfer from the knowledge of the language to using the language, is often not the merit of the classroom. It's often the merit of the children themselves, depending on the social background they come from. That's why we often see that children from higher social backgrounds have less difficulties in a proficiency-based approach than children from lower social backgrounds. When it comes to the discussion about what do we do with all these languages in our classrooms? Do we have to ignore them? Do we have to exploit them? Do we have to teach them? What we see is that it is, at least in Flanders, it is a very binary discussion between multilingual education and the believers, the believers of multilingual education programs and the believers of L2 submersion. And each of them, and I'm not talking about teachers or principals, I'm talking about academics. Each of us, we all have our arguments and we all have our empirical evidence. What I think is that this binary discussion is counterproductive. I once called it the clash of the titans. But it is definitely a search for a one-size-fits-all model with a lot of polarization going on. I once had a discussion with our former Minister of Education, who said to me, yes, but Mr. Van Avermaet, multilingualism leads to zero-lingualism. These were the kind of views that existed and still exist. Well, I can tell you a lot more about it. That's during the discussions I had with the former Minister of Education. Anyway, there is a lot of advocacy for an L2 submersion model, competition between languages, negative transfer, children are a sponge, young children are automatic L2 learners, there's time on task, frequency of input, but at the same time arguments, advocacy for multilingual education, compensatory programs, linguistic dependency, positive transfer from L1 to L2, and then the idea of scaffolding, building from one language to the other. And I can give you lists and lists of research projects that are in favor of submersion models and of multilingual models. But it doesn't help me as a teacher, it doesn't help me as a principal, because it is a question to a large extent of believers and non-believers. Now let me give, I mean, I'm critical to submersion models because nothing is done with all these repertoires of kids in the classroom. But at the same time, I'm also critical to traditional bilingual programs because it is in as well spatially as temporally. It is, as Angela already said, and it is very it is a very separation model. In the sense that Turkish kids are pulled out of the classroom for a couple of hours, they are put in separate classes, there's hardly, in most cases, hardly any interaction between the mainstream, the teacher of the mainstream classroom and the Turkish or the Arabic teacher, in terms of exchanges, experiences, intercultural or transcultural experiences, or building transcultural competencies in these mainstream classes. You hardly observe anything. So the idea of compartmentalized languages, as Karen said, or parallel monolingualisms, as Angela and Adrian said in their 2010 paper. So there is also an enormous educational challenge and consequences of these traditional or customary bilingual education programs. There is a need of instruction by bilingual teachers. Now, when the school is 100% Turkish children, it's easy to find a Turkish teacher. But when we are talking about 20 different languages, how on earth, from a practical perspective, do you organize traditional bilingual education programs? I mean, in '98 I was in Australia, in Melbourne, and there I saw the LOTI programs. I don't know whether they still exist, the LOTI programs. But I was extremely fascinated. But
languages other than English.
I'm sorry, yeah, languages other than English. But what I saw was that in some schools there were indeed 10, 15, in those days, 10, 15 different languages. And for each of these languages there were teachers. I don't know how they organized it, and I still don't know how it is organized. But definitely in our context, it is very complex. And theoretically, what I saw, and I don't know whether that's still in the LOTI classes, but what I saw in Flanders in some bilingual experiments was that the amount of hours that these kids were taught in their home language was often between 2 and 4 hours per week. And from research we know that the impact on language learning is nil. It has no impact nor on the maintenance of their mother tongue, nor on the acquisition of the target language. So, and there was often and is often a low involvement of mainstream teachers overall. Now, what are the day-to-day realities? A multitude of languages, as I already said. But above all, the school, and this is something that we as teachers tend to forget, that the school is a social space. At first it is a social space. It is a space in which not only languages is a language, or the dominant language is learned, be it explicitly or implicitly, but it is a space in which children want to interact, in which children want to communicate and construct knowledge. Whatever resources they have available to communicate. Children want to unravel knowledge, and be it in Dutch, be it in Turkish, be it in dialect, be it in a combination, through process of translanguaging, they are eager in learning. And this is what we have to take into account, that it is within that social context that these kids want to participate, that they want to feel safe, a safe environment, that they want to be motivated, that they want to be involved, that they want to be active actors in learning processes. And I don't know to what extent this is the case here, but what on most of my observations in Flemish schools is that children are, even nowadays, still too much passive actors in the learning process.